years is the global cosmopolitan nature of the culture, the mobility and the space for civilized conversation, which rings a bell for me because of what I was saying earlier today in my talk about the new affinity towards redefining the cosmopolitan in a globalized world, and the need for creating new spaces for conversation and for developing affiliations that are outside the nation and its national boundaries and its institutions and organizations, but which can occur in more intimate spaces. And I did talk about the concept of the transnation, which has been presented by a post-colonial scholar called Bill Ashcroft, and he distinguishes between the striated space of the nation, which is the place where the striated space of the state, which is where the state is ordered, where the government institutions exist, and the space of the transnation, which is not bounded by nationality, but which is a space of potential, and where change can occur, and where he says literature in fact belongs, because literature touches the imagination and it reaches into a world beyond the one that we are in. And so I think that we've come full circle, but with some remarkable changes at the same time.
I think that brings in so many issues, and that makes our conversation so contemporary.
Yes.
What's happening today.
Yes.
That's what
Yes.
Janet has.
Now I would like to invite Lisa Smith to talk about the things.
Well, this is a prime example for me of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis to look at the nature of interaction between scholars, between disciplines, between transnational efforts. And actually, if I was to scale up your conversation to look at it from a macro perspective, you could have been talking about interdisciplinarity and talking about the nature of how networking and the co-production of knowledge comes about. And for me, it could be through post-colonial studies, as equally as it could be through physics or the physical sciences. And it was very interesting to hear your opening discussion around open spaces. And in my research environment, that has connotations about how we transcend the boundaries and barriers of language. And language has often been, when working in an interdisciplinary way, has often been tagged as one of the biggest barriers. And actually, I don't believe it is. I think that the biggest barrier is not providing open spaces in which dialogue and the getting to know the nature of each person's individual behaviours and motivations around their research environment, and also having a space in which you can find out about each other, transcends the language. It starts to find and enable teams and networks of complex knowledge and individuals to be able to find confluence through pure epistemological debate and discussion, where you come unencumbered by your disciplinary specificity to find new ways to interact, to find intersection between both your methodologies, or challenges as well as intersections, places where you might not be able to tease out and come together. It's just as important. So open spaces for me I'm coming from a broader context of how it provides an environment where you can have dialogue unencumbered. And the notion of globality and cosmopolitan was very interesting for me, because the notion of being able to travel through a landscape, whether that landscape is around, again, post-colonial literature or culture, for me it's about travelling the landscape through and across disciplines. And if you wander, when you have a disciplinary specificity, you're equipped to be able to wander and feel confident about your roots and your disciplinary capacity and capability. And therefore, when you wander across the landscape of different disciplines, you feel confident to be able to challenge others and also to accept criticism and challenge from other disciplines. So although you talked about globality and the cosmopolitan, I talk about it in terms of the landscape of the disciplines and what threads one might bring back with one when you've had that journey. So we've ended up talking about the same things, but from completely different perspectives. And as an interdisciplinarian and somebody who brings networks together, I'm very interested in the analogies we share and the spaces we share.
Yes, Dr. Lisa. When I spoke of multilinguality, I was referring mainly to very many languages of speech and languages of literature.
Yes, yeah.
But as you rightly pointed out, multilinguality also involves languages of various disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you want to know whether the economic basis of colonial exploitation has ceased to be, and whether there is truly an open marketplace, we have to understand the language of economics,
Mm-hmm.
but also social sciences and also physical sciences.
Yes, that's right.
I think whether these languages of various disciplines come from a single knowledge system, or whether they come from different knowledge systems, becomes now an important question in light of what you have said. Because dominant cultures often present their ways of knowing and their tools of knowledge as ultimate ways and ultimate tools.
Yes.
When in a new, wider space, several sciences would come together. We are sitting in Bhaskaracharya Center here. Now, I think we ought to know in a global forum, not only Newton, but also Bhaskaracharya.
Yes, yeah.
And that's where your comments become very central to us.
Could I just make a comment here that we're all speaking in the language of the colonizer, and so there is a kind of irony in that, because in fact all these concepts that we're sharing have an agreed semantic base, which is one that's imposed from another culture. And as I said, I do feel rather disadvantaged because I'm not able to share linguistically your vernacular, but possibly we would be talking in a slightly different way if we were speaking in Gujarat. And so, this idea of a knowledge base as being at variance between different disciplines and even different language systems, to some degree becomes leavened out because of the need for mutual communication in a single global language.
I think that's where translation comes in.
Yes, indeed.
So instant
Yes.
translation, machine translation, or whatever, so that we could be
Yes, mutually accessible.
accessible. Professor Singh has done so much work in colonial and post-colonial cultures, and with reference to India,
Yes.
that I'm very curious to.
First of all, I feel enormously honored as I sit on this side and as I am part of this panel, and listening to Sudhanshu Chandra and thereafter to Janet Wilson and Dr. Smith. There are more questions than answers in my mind, and I would begin with a few questions and maybe I'll leave it to you to connect those fragmented arguments. I do agree with Dr. Janet Wilson that it's a kind of irony that we are speaking about post-colonialism, in the language of the colonization, if we believe in that. In lighter vein, I would say that we will keep speaking in language till you learn Gujarati.
I can see
And
I'm going to have to come back
you will
to do that.
you will learn Gujarati when economics of Gujarati becomes stronger than the economics of English.
Yes. Good point.
So that language and economics, these are the two things that go together,
Yes.
and then economics is followed by army.
Yes, yeah.
Anyway, this you can delete from the from the statement that I'm going to make subsequently. But in lighter vein also there are some traces of truth. I would like to focus on three broad issues that I picked up from all three learned presentations. One is what Sudhanshuji said about post-colonialism is relevant in terms of the topic that we have chosen for our present discussion, because colonization was a clash of knowledge systems. Apparently it was clash of two political armies, but primarily at one level it was a clash of knowledge systems, and to good extent both of them learned. Maybe India was discovered by Europe by this clash of knowledge systems, so much so that by 1815 almost all major universities in Europe had a chair of professor in Sanskrit, from England to Germany and some places. Ironically, when Europe was raving about Indian knowledge and the body of knowledge, like an Indology was being constructed, there was a view when there was skepticism among Indians, for right reasons, I think. The same kind of clash of knowledge systems is taking place in 21st century, the period that we call as the period of post-colonialism. So what has happened is perhaps the pace has changed, but things are happening almost in the same way. So much so that one can say that even in the clash of civilizations, the famous theory that we tend to reject out of our idealism, but in fact there is some truth in it. There is the different knowledge systems, little knowledge systems, and dominant knowledge systems, represented by what Professor Sudhanshuji mentioned as the discourse of modernity or modernization of Europe. These little knowledge systems are also clashing, and it would be very interesting to see how many of them would survive after 25 years, 30 years. Fortunately, in India, there are scholars like Sudhanshuji who are going to the archives of knowledge. Say, for instance, what Persians wrote about Gujarati, and so on. Some of us who have seen his editorial in the Forward Society Journal would certainly be benefited. Dr. Janet Wilson and Dr. Lisa Smith can't read Gujarati, but that's one of the premier journals of Gujarati, and maybe that's to be considered at some stage when we think of knowledge as such. When we think of knowledge available only in English, perhaps we are doing gross injustice to what we call real knowledge. Keeping this in mind, what happens is that if post-colonialism is a trope for space for dialogue, I have no problem with this. But in reality, if we look at, then what one finds is that all these words like what Sir mentioned, globality, or maybe these are used as a category to discuss a few things wherein the real issues are in a way skirted. like say for instance, if we are discussing post-colonialism, then um, the way people are writing in Gujarati, Marathi or Hindi, and the best critics in these languages, they either do not write in English or they do not want to write in English. They are writing in these languages, and they are also registering forces of exploitation. If colonialism had something wrong in it, it was primarily the process of exploitation that systematically desystematized the native institutions and exploited human resources, natural resources, intellectual resources through translation, and economic resources, of course, and dented psychologically. So in our all Indian languages, if second statement I am making is, if post-colonialism is a trope for a discourse registering exploitation, then these critics are doing in these languages, but they are not writing in English. Most of them are not writing in English, though most of them can write in English. Like if Professor Tanshu wants to write in English, then he is better than all the teachers in English available, at least in this state. I shouldn't make an overstatement. So what is happening is that as a trope, then in which sense are we using it? And in reality, otherwise, if we look at that, if post-colonialism becomes a kind of excuse for allow a kind of where we allow space, we allow others to speak, allow to have dialogue, then this is again a very condescending kind of attitude that we carry with us. In that sense, if we look at, then one feels like, if one becomes slightly pessimistic, then one feels it is